What's going on, everyone? James Hancock here. As many of you have probably already heard, Joker won the top prize, the Golden Lion Award, this past weekend at the Venice Film Festival. And I was already foaming at the mouth to see this movie, but if possible, my curiosity has only intensified. While we won't have the chance to see the movie in theaters for a few more weeks, as a way of scratching my itch to see the movie, last night I decided to revisit Martin Scorsese's The King of Comedy, one of the biggest influences on director Todd Phillips and his approach to directing Joker. To put it mildly, I was blown away all over again by this remarkable movie, and I thought it'd be fun to do a little flashback review. If you're not familiar with the movie, the story's about Rupert Pupkin, an aspiring comedian who teams up with this celebrity-crazed friend Masha in order to kidnap talk show host Jerry Langford, all in an effort to force him to give Rupert his big break on late-night television. Having not seen the Joker, I can only speculate about the connections between Joker and the King of Comedy, but my understanding is that there's a lot of overlap between the portrayal of Joaquin Phoenix's character Arthur Fleck and the character Rupert Pupkin, played by Robert De Niro in The King of Comedy. Furthermore, Joker set in a similar time period, the year 1981, while The King of Comedy was released in the US in early 1983. Best of all, as a little tip of the hat to the earlier movie, Robert De Niro is one of the stars of Joker, playing a character that strongly resembles a much older version of Rupert Pupkin, who now has a few decades of experience under his belt. I'll elaborate on these connections more in October once I've seen Joker, but for now, let's just focus on King of Comedy, a Scorsese movie that historically hasn't received nearly enough love, but that appears to be changing. While some older viewers out there might have a sense of nostalgia for the film, I didn't see it for the first time until many years after its release. While in college in the late 90s, my friends and I regarded Martin Scorsese as a god. I still do, but Scorsese had just released Casino, and he was considered to be at the absolute top of his game at that time. But my fellow fans and I, we spent most of our time watching the obvious Scorsese classics, movies like Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and Goodfellas. Those of us who are a little more hardcore might watch movies like The Last Waltz or The Color of Money or After Hours, but for some reason, watching King of Comedy was always very low on our to-do list. But from the perspective of this year, 2019, it's incredible to me just how much this movie's reputation has soared over the last 20 years. I eventually did see it on VHS while I was still in college, and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't until a few years ago when I revisited it that I finally recognized it for the twisted little dark comedy masterpiece that it is. This is a movie that was ignored by most people when first released. With a budget of $19 million, it grossed only $2.5, making it one of the biggest flops of the year by far. Scorsese's career took a massive hit with that failure. Luckily, After Hours and The Color of Money, a few years later, put Scorsese back on firm footing, but he was really struggling at the time of King of Comedy. He was coming off several tough shoots in a row, and his health was an absolute mess. Oftentimes, he could only shoot a few hours per day, but somehow the movie got made, one that features some of the best improvised, spontaneous comedy that Scorsese's ever created as a filmmaker. Some critics sang its praises at the time, but the public just rejected it. And as much as I love the movie, I can see why this movie was and remains a bit of a tough sell for some people. The King of Comedy employs a style of comedy that makes the viewer frequently cringe in embarrassment on behalf of the characters, but what really hammers home this embarrassment for all of us is when we start to see and recognize behavior that we may or may not have been guilty of ourselves in the past. Most audience members, when they go to the movies, they just want to be entertained and head home with a big smile on their face, but The King of Comedy cuts really deep and forces us to confront the ugly side of our celebrity-obsessed culture, where being near celebrities or becoming one yourself has reached a level of near religious hysteria. And deeper still, the movie mercilessly hacks into our ability to delude ourselves into thinking we're living in one reality, one that might bear little resemblance to the objective reality that actually surrounds us. So quick warning, if you haven't seen the movie from here on out, I will be discussing crucial ingredients of the plot. So if that's a problem for you, now's the time to hunt down the film, give it a go. So last warning about spoilers, etc. But moving on. In my opinion, the success of this movie all boils down to the brilliant screenplay by Paul Zimmerman, coupled with the extraordinary performances by Robert De Niro, Jerry Lewis, and Sandra Bernhard, all of whom just knock it out of the park. Scorsese's gone so far as to say he thinks this is the best performance by De Niro in any of his movies, an idea I might have pushed back on a few years ago, but I'm starting to see what Scorsese's talking about. Each time I see this movie, De Niro's performance makes me laugh a little harder, cringe in embarrassment a little bit more, so much so that I now end up missing a ton of the movie's dialogue just because I'm cackling away like a crazy person.
Mom!
Take it easy. Lower it.
I'm not going to lower it. I have to do this now.
I don't mind you playing it, but lower it.
But Jerry Lewis, he just kills it. Historically, he was known as this manic, crazed performer, which we really only see in one scene where he's being chased across an intersection by Bernhard. But I love his depiction of this world-weary, just over-it persona in Jerry Langford. A pro's been at the top of the game for years and has seen so much crazy shit at this point that he hardly blinks an eye when he's kidnapped by overzealous fans. Also, as a show of respect for Jerry Lewis's own career as a director, Martin Scorsese allowed Jerry Lewis to direct a scene in the movie where we see a disappointed fan screaming at him,
"You should only get cancer. I hope you get cancer."
But for me, the movie's real secret weapon is Sandra Bernhard. This was her first starring role, and I don't think she's ever been better. But according to legend, she improvised most of her dialogue per Scorsese's request in order to keep her performance as unpredictable and as delightfully insane as possible. But what's most interesting to me with this movie is how Scorsese's signature visual style is somewhat subdued. Movies like Taxi Driver and Raging Bull and Goodfellas, they're visual feasts with some of the most astonishing cinematography and camera movements you will ever see in any movie. But with King of Comedy, Scorsese kind of taps the brakes and does something much more subtle, which ties in perfectly with the central theme of the movie. Rupert Pupkin's inner subjective reality and his outer objective reality frequently get a little blurry for him, and what really hammers this home is how whether or not Pupkin is having one of his showbiz fantasies or not, Scorsese chooses to shoot the movie in the exact same way. For example, the first time we see Jerry Langford heaping praise on Pupkin, it's a little jarring until finally we realize that Pupkin's basically in his basement playing make-believe, acting out all of his wishful thinking, all while his mother, played by Scorsese's actual mother, berates him from upstairs to keep it down. De Niro's performance in these scenes, it's so raw and so vulnerable and heartbreakingly revealing that I almost have trouble watching the movie. And while we might laugh at Pupkin's delusions of grandeur, if we're being honest, the movie forces us to confront any delusions we might be clinging to in our own lives, which is part of why I think audiences in the early 80s just said no to this movie. Some of these fantasies just make my face turn purple with embarrassment, like when Pupkin imagines his high school principal apologizing to him on behalf of the entire world for never believing in him, or when he imagines that Jerry Langford has invited him to come out to his home to work on some material, leading to the most cringe-inducing scene in the entire movie when Rupert and his unsuspecting date go to Jerry's home as if the invite were actually genuine. And it's not as if Rupert's some poor, misunderstood victim. When he's around his fellow Langford fans and autograph hunters, he looks down on them, frequently talking shit to them about how he and Jerry have a real relationship, a wild boast based solely on the fact that Pupkin managed to sneak into Jerry's car with him one night. Also, Rupert has a really hostile side that's kind of hidden just below the surface of his good-natured exterior. He spends a lot of his time in total isolation, and today it's so easy to poke fun at similar behavior that we see on a daily basis on social media. But people were just as crazy in the early 80s. You simply had to go out in public to get a taste of it. The big question, though, is whether or not we can trust the ending. As Pupkin says, better to be king for a night than a schmuck for a lifetime, after he successfully gets to perform his act on Jerry's show. And the first few times I saw the movie, I totally bought Rupert's victory at face value. But as I was watching it this time, the final lingering shot by Scorsese, with the camera gradually pushing in on Rupert, made me feel as if perhaps there's a strong case to be made that we're watching yet another Pupkin fantasy, that we're not quite sure when the movie made the switch. Because reality and fantasy are shot in the exact same fashion in this movie, there's abundant evidence to make a case either way. And what's cool is that both Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy explore this territory, and in its own way, King of Comedy is almost as disturbing as Taxi Driver. As Scorsese himself states in the documentary about the movie, Taxi Driver, Travis, Rupert, the isolated person. Is Rupert more violent than Travis? Maybe. But looking beyond some of the themes and ideas of the movie, there's so much more to enjoy. As is the case with many of his movies, we have a great Scorsese cameo at work behind the scenes on The Jerry Langford Show. Also, one of Scorsese's favorite bands, The Clash, has a killer cameo fighting Rupert for access to a payphone when Rupert's trying desperately to hang onto this phone for a return phone call, one that's never going to come. And for the diehard film nerds, we even have a clip of Samuel L. Fuller's Pickup on South Street playing on TV. Fuller's one of Scorsese's filmmaking heroes, and deservedly so. If you haven't seen his movies, The Naked Kiss, Shock Corridor, The Big Red One, White Dog, they'll all blow your mind. In any event, The King of Comedy is a genuine obscure gem, always worthy of rediscovery. And while I might typically look down on directors who allow their actors to improvise too freely on the set, this is one of those movies that gives the art of improvisation a very good name. So I think that's all I have to say for now on the topic of The King of Comedy. I'll be revisiting this topic when I review Joker in a couple weeks. But if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, give the channel a subscribe, all that good stuff. That's very helpful to me. And if you want to talk more about Scorsese or Joker or whatever, you can always find me on Twitter @Colbrax. I can't thank you again for watching. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.